I sent out a daily email. It's called American Minute. It started as a 60-second radio spot, and then people started asking for the transcript, and so I began to email it and thought, well, gee, I can add just a little bit extra to it, and it doesn't cost anything, right? So it ended up getting longer. People say, you should call it an American half hour or something. I did look up the word minutes. It has several meanings, and one is like a meeting. You have the minutes of the meeting, and sometimes they're more than 60 seconds, and so I sort of throw it under that definition. Anyway, so I have one on Russia, from the Vikings to the Mongols to the Tsars to socialist dictators to the Ukraine invasion. Beginning in the late 1700s, Vikings from Scandinavia, called Danes and Swedes, began raiding the coasts of Europe, up and down the rivers of England and Europe. They were from the north, and they were referred to as Northmen or Norsemen or Normans. And the Normans raided up the Seine River into France, eventually claiming an area that took their name, Normandy. So that's the central area of France. They were pagan, but then they became Christian. So Normans are like Christian Vikings. Anyway, the Norse raided as far south as the Muslim-controlled Mediterranean Sea. And you had these Vikings raided across the Baltic Sea. They looted from the Finns, Wends, and Slavs on the northern coast of Europe, eventually founding trading settlements. Now, Russia's primary chronicle made the first written mention of the Scandinavian tribe. They call them Varangians or Rus around the year 859 AD, which began taxing the Slavs and the Finns. So the word Rus is probably derived from the Finnish word for the Swedes, and it's ruosti, which may have come from the Swedish word for rower. So they were Vikings that would row boats. And so the Finns called the Swedes rowers, and that's rusosti, which they think that's where the word Rus or Russian came from. So rowers, so basically they were the Vikings. And if you're going to compare Ukraine and Russia, it's basically two cities. Kiev is Ukraine and Moscow is Russia. But over the centuries, they sort of get combined into the same kingdoms and then split apart and then combined and so forth. So it's a little tricky. The area of Ukraine up the Dnieper River, they had the city Kiev, and it possibly dates back to the time of the Scythians of the 7th century BC. And if you read the Bible, even on the day of Pentecost, it says all the different peoples that were there, and some of them are Scythians. And by the 6th century AD, the inhabitants of the area were called Polans, and you can see that's also the root for the word Poland. It's an Eastern Slavic people, and they occupied both sides of the Dnieper River. Now, if you can look at the map there, we'll slow down and go look at the map. You see the Black Sea, and then south of the Black Sea is Turkey, which is used to be the Byzantine Empire. And then north of the Black Sea, you have that huge green area, and that was the Slavic area that basically was Kiev and Ukraine. So the word Polans is derived from the old Eastern Slavic word for field, as the area is a very fertile field. The king of the Polans was named Kiev, and that's where you get the name of the city, Kiev. North of Kiev, 550 miles, trading port on the Baltic Sea, named Novgorod. And Novgorod has got a pretty cool story. The word means new town, and it was founded in 859 AD. And again, you can keep looking at those maps and sort of get an idea. Novgorod was the first and only republic in that area of the world. So the most common form of government in world history is kings. Pharaohs, Caesars, Kaisers, Sultans, Tsars. As the centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger. Every now and then you would have a republic. Real quick, democracy is where the people rule themselves, but everybody has to be at every meeting every day to talk about every issue. And so it could only get as big as a city. So the Greeks called them city-states. Republics is where you take care of your family and your farm, and you have someone in your place that goes to the market every day and talks politics. They are your representatives. So republics could get bigger, but the people were still in charge. So Novgorod was a republic. They had no king for several centuries. But the problem is, when you have no king and you have a republic, they usually get prosperous. And then they become a target for attack. and kings want to attack them and take them over, and then the republic's gone. And America, became prosperous, and the king wanted us back, but we had a 3,000-mile ocean that allowed us to maintain our republic. So Novgorod, it grew to be the region's second biggest city after Kiev, holding sway over a huge area as large as Sweden. Novgorod is considered the first city of the Rus people. Their capital was there in Novgorod until Oleg of Novgorod took control of the lands of the Polans and moved the capital to Kiev in 882 AD. So we're stretching way back in time. So they call them Kievian Rus, and that's the term used in the history books. So they refer to a loose confederation of Slavic, Baltic, and Finnic people from the 9th century through the 13th century under the Rurik dynasty. So it controlled the land stretching from the White Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. That's basically all of that Eastern Europe area, away from the cold North Baltic Sea all the way to the Black Sea that empties into the Mediterranean. Anyway, Oleg of Novgorod's son was Igor, and he plundered as far south as the Arab Muslims on the Caspian Sea. Igor besieged Constantinople twice and forced the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII to submit to a treaty in 945 AD. Igor was killed collecting taxes. Sort of gory how he was killed. They stretched 2 trees down and with ropes. Then they tied the ropes to his 2 legs, and then they let the trees go and ripped him in half. I'm sorry. If my wife was here, she's like, don't tell those stories. Pastor was saying, ask the person next to you if you're in your right mind. It's like, if my wife was next to me, she'd probably say, yeah, I'm not. So Oleg was later converted. So Igor is now ripped in half and leaving his widow, Olga, and Olga rules Kiev. And now scroll back just a little bit, Johnny, thank you. So Olga is now ruling Kiev till her son, and it's a little tricky pronunciation, Sviatoslav. Okay, Sviatoslav, till her son was old enough to take power. So Olga, guess what? She converts to Christianity. And she is such a good Christian woman that the Eastern Orthodox Church calls Olga a saint. And then finally her son gets old enough, so Sviatoslav was a fierce warrior. He expanded the Kievan Rus Empire to become the largest state in Europe at the time. We're talking bigger than France, bigger than Germany. I mean, this is a huge place. It encompasses the Volga River from the Pontic Steppes all the way to the Balkans. Sviatoslav invaded the first Bulgarian Empire, and get this, he destroyed the powerful Jewish kingdom of Khazars. Now, the Jews, the 10 northern tribes of Israel, remember they're taken captive to the north, and everybody sort of lost track of them? Well, they basically formed this kingdom called the Khazars, and they were a powerful kingdom that was Eastern Europe and a little bit further. So they were sort of a buffer state between the Islamic states and Europe. These Khazars, they were keeping the Muslims at bay and so forth. But this Sviatoslav destroys the Jewish Khazar state. And then Sviatoslav threatens the Byzantine Empire. I know this is a little bit hard to track with me, but you can go to my website, AmericanMinute.com, and read it again slower. Now, the Byzantine Emperor during this time is John I Tzimizkes. He was occupied fighting the Islamic armies of an Islamic army. Okay. So we got this Byzantine emperor, and he is now fighting the Muslim empire. I wrote a whole book on the history of the spread of Islam. And so this John Tzimizkes, not only is he fighting the Muslims, he's having to face this Sviatoslav. And so what did he do? He decides he's going to bribe an ally of Sviatoslav named Khan Curry of the Penetchegs which is a semi-nomadic Turkic tribe, to ambush and kill Sviatoslav as he crossed the narrow rapids of the Dnieper River. So you can see the picture there. Go back a little bit. Yeah, there's the picture. And there's Sviatoslav in the boat, and he's ambushed and killed. So you can go a little bit further. So Sviatoslav's oldest son is Yaropolk I. He took power of the Kievan Rus Empire. He kills his brother Oleg, and this causes the youngest brother, Vladimir, to flee to Scandinavia. So originally the Scandinavians come down. They're the Rus, basically. They're Vikings that basically take over running what would become Russia. And now Vladimir flees, and he goes back to the Swedes for protection because of his brother Yaropolk. So with the help of these Swedes, and I'm not going to even bother pronouncing the Swedish name, Vladimir comes back with the Swedish army. He retakes Novgorod. He has his brother ambushed and killed, and Vladimir is now in control of the Baltic Sea down to Bulgaria, including modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. So look at that big map and that big, huge area controlled by Vladimir. Now, a little bit further, 986 AD, Vladimir decided that he is going to do what his mother did and to get rid of the pagan gods. So he throws all the pagan Russian gods in the Dnieper River, and he decides he's going to embrace monotheism. But he hasn't decided which monotheistic faith. So very soon, some Bulgar Muslims come, and they invite Vladimir to become a Muslim. And the primary chronicle of Russia, which is the first official document of Russia, it gives the account. And so it says the Muslim ambassadors, replied to Vladimir that they believed in Allah, that Muhammad instructed them to practice circumcision, to eat no pork, to drink no wine, and after death promised them complete fulfillment of their carnal desires. Muhammad, they asserted, will give each man 70 fair women. He may choose one fair woman, and upon that woman will Muhammad confer the charms of all of them, and she shall be his wife. Muhammad promises that one day, that one may then satisfy every desire, but whoever is poor in this world will be no different in the next. They also spoke of other false things which out of modesty may not be written down. The primary chronicle concluded, Vladimir listened to them, for he was fond of women and indulgence regarding when he heard of the pleasure. But circumcision and abstinence from pork and wine were disagreeable to him. Drinking, said he, is the joy of the Russes. We cannot exist without that pleasure. I just think it's funny that Russia didn't convert to Islam because Vladimir liked to drink. So next, Vladimir is visited by Germans who were part of the Latin Roman Catholic Church, but he decided not to convert to that. He was visited by the Jewish Khazars, and his attitude was, okay, you offended your God, and he chased you out of your city of Jerusalem, and you want me to follow you, right? Anyway, then finally comes the Greeks from the Eastern Orthodox Empire. Look at that picture. That's the Hagia Sophia. It was the biggest church in the world, right? The Vatican had not been built yet. It's 165 feet high, 102 foot across dome, 4 acres of gold mosaics. I've been there, right? I mean, it's just enormous cavern. And so the ambassadors visit this, and it's the Hagia Sophia Cathedral in Constantinople. It was the most ornate church in the world for 1,000 years. And the envoys sent to visit it come back to Vladimir, and they said, we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. We only know that God dwells there among the people, and their service is fairer than the ceremonies of the other nations. So upon hearing that, and the gospel, and learning that the New Testament had been written in the Greek language. So the Greeks basically come to Vladimir and said, look, the New Testament was written in our language. We sort of have a corner on the market on this Christian thing. And so Vladimir decides he's going to convert to the Eastern Orthodox Christianity and make it the official religion for all of Russia. And he adopts Nicholas as the patron saint of Russia. So for those not familiar, Nicholas was the most popular Greek saint, lived during Roman times, gave to the poor, but he wanted to do it anonymously because he wanted the credit to go to God and not to him. And so Nicholas would sneak into the villages and throw money in the window of poor people at nighttime. Supposedly the money landed in a shoe or a stocking that was drying by the fireplace. right? And so that was the origins of the midnight visits of St. Nicholas. And anyway, Vladimir proceeded to have all the Kievan Russians baptized into the Orthodox Christian Church. And then he sent his younger brother, Yaroslav the Wise, to rule the area of Novgorod. And relations between Vladimir and his son Yaroslav began to get strained. When Vladimir died in 1015, his older brother, Svyatopolk, the Accursed, I'd like to have that name, and 3 other brothers were killed, and Yaroslav seized power. The citizens of Novgorod supported Yaroslav against Svyatopolk. Yaroslav finally won in 1019 and proceeded to reward the citizens of Novgorod who supported him with the privilege of freedom. So we're talking about this Novgorod. He has this history of being a republic, and they back this guy, and then he gives them some more freedom. This effectively laid the foundation for the independent Novgorod Republic, which was a big deal on the northern Europe for several centuries. It was on the trade routes on the way from northern Europe down to Roman Constantinople. With its economy based on Baltic sea trade, Novgorod joined in the 1100s, the Hellenic League of rich Baltic ports, which included Russia, Sweden, Denmark, northern Germany, which traded to Holland and England. Novgorod grew in wealth, constructed elaborate stone walls, beautiful Church of St. Sophia. It's the main cathedral of the Russian north. By 1136, merchants had accumulated more power than the nobles, resulting in a government by the people. And now there's a neighboring city of Pskov, founded in 903, and it adhered politically to the Novgorod Republic. So Novgorod and Pskov were the only major cities in Russia to escape the destruction of the Mongols in 1222. So let me stop here. Genghis Khan decides to conquer all of Central Asia. Genghis Khan kills 30 million people from Korea to Hungary to Russia, and Genghis Khan forms in the 1200s the largest contiguous land empire in world history. Contiguous means land connected. And partly it was because the Mongols had invented the composite bow. So you know the English longbow? It was like 6 feet tall, and this thing could shoot 300 yards. Well, the composite bow was the recurve bow. And it could shoot 300 yards, but since it was short, they could shoot it on horseback. So these Mongols would have a huge, 100,000 Mongols on horseback would ride up, and from 300 yards away, they would shower these arrows down, and the other armies couldn't even reach them. And so the Mongols were able to conquer very quickly this huge area. They would have continued to conquer had not Genghis Khan died, and they had an enormous funeral. And they killed everybody they met along the way. They diverted a river. They buried him in the middle of the river. Then they diverted the river back, and then they killed everybody that was part of the funeral. So nobody knew where Genghis Khan was buried. Anyway, my wife would probably say, don't tell those stories. So 1240 AD, Novgorod invited the Prince Alexander to protect it from the Swedish army. So the Swedes is where it all started, but now they're wanting to attack this area. Alexander defeats the Swedes near the Neva River, resulting in his title Alexander Nevsky. Now that's a big name in Russian history, Alexander Nevsky. And the main avenue in St. Petersburg is named for him, Nevsky Prospect. In 1242 AD, Alexander Nevsky saves Novgorod again from the state of the Teutonic Knights. And then Alexander Nevsky recaptures Pskov in a legendary campaign which included the Battle of the Ice. So it was a whole battle that took place on a frozen lake. And it was memorialized in a 1938 movie. When the Mongols became powerful, they were the most powerful foe to Alexander Nevsky decided in 1252 to meet with the Mongol ruler of the Golden Horde, and his name was Sartak Khan. And he's the son of Bantu Khan, and he's the great son of Genghis Khan. Now, the Sartak Khan's an interesting guy. Sartak Khan converts to Christianity. So now you have a Christian Mongol who rules over Russia, and he has Alexander Nevsky as his vassal. And since Alexander Nevsky is Christian and Sartak Khan is Christian, they sort of get along. And anyway, so other Khan leaders, were at least favorable to Christianity, was Hulagu Khan. He's another grandson of Genghis Khan. Now, Hulagu Khan is interesting because he sent letters to St. Louis. All right, St. Louis was and it was this letter that said, hey, you attack the Muslims from land and or from sea on the Mediterranean in Egypt, and we'll attack from land and we'll wipe out the Muslims. And so sort of an interesting mix there. And so then they had a brother named Kublai Khan, and you might know that name because he ended up ruling China. And now the mother of Kublai Khan and Sartak Khan, anyway, a lot of Khans, is a Christian princess named Sorg Katani Beki, and she is a Christian mom. So we got Genghis Khan, he's a killer, right? But then the one son of Genghis Khan marries this Christian princess, and then she has these other ones that are sort of friendly to Christianity. Now, Hulagu Khan destroys the Islamic capital in Baghdad. He kills over 100,000 people. Hulagu Khan imprisons the Muslim caliph, starving him in a room with all of his treasure, then rolled him in a carpet and had his horses trample him to death. Now, why is that? Because the Muslim legend was that this caliph was so important that his blood couldn't touch the ground. And so Hulagu Khan put him in a carpet, rolled it up, and rolled over him so his blood didn't touch the ground. Anyway, but here he was like so rich, but he locks him in a room full of gold and doesn't feed him. I just think that sort of, has a little poetic irony to it. Hulagu Khan weakened Muslim control of Damascus in 1260. 1262, Hulagu Khan sent, this is the letter I talked about, a letter to the French king, Louis IX, St. Louis, proposing that they fight in a joint crusade together to recapture Jerusalem and drive the Muslims out of Egypt. So sort of interesting. And this is the letter. From the head of the Mongol army, anxious to devastate the perfidious nation of the Saracens, Muslims, with the goodwill support of the Christian faith, so that you, who are the rulers of the coasts of the other side of the seas, endeavor to deny a refuge for the infidels, your enemies and ours, by having your subjects diligently patrol the seas. The problem was they missed the timing by 1 year. So Louis IX showed up in Egypt, but there was no Hulagu army, and so Louis IX ended up getting defeated. Hulagu's brother, Kublai Khan, became the emperor of the Mongolian Empire of China, Korea, North India, Persia, Hungary, and, you guessed it, Russia. So Kublai Khan had requested a Venetian traveler, Marco Polo, bring back to China 100 teachers of the holy Christian faith and a flask of oil from Christ's empty tomb in Jerusalem. And but unfortunately, there was like a period of time when there were like 3 popes and they all had armies and they were fighting, and they only were able to get like 2 Franciscan friars instead of 100 teachers, and then those 2 Franciscan friars got scared and went back to Europe. And so think how history would have been different if those Franciscan friars would have had courage. They would have had a total open door to evangelize all of China and that whole huge area. So Marco Polo dies, and a century and a half later, Columbus is born there in Genoa. And so he hears about the stories of Marco Polo. And Columbus writes, concerning the lands of India and a prince called the Grand Khan, how many times he sent to Rome to seek doctors in our holy faith to instruct him, and never had the Holy Father provided them. And thus so many peoples were lost through lapsing into idolatries. And your highnesses, devoted to the holy Christian faith, enemies of the sect of Mohammed, resolved to send me, Christopher Columbus, to the said regions of India to see the said princes and peoples, and the manner in which may be undertaken for their conversion to our holy faith. And so this is the movie where you got Sartak Khan, the great-grandson of Genghis Khan, who's now a Christian, and Alexander Nevsky, and who's his vassal, and he gets the title of Grand Duke of Vladimir. Sartak Khan mysteriously dies, and he's suspected to have been poisoned by his uncle Berky Khan. who had converted to Islam. Berke Khan determined to be a devout Muslim, and he took control of the Mongolian armies called the Golden Horde and spread Islam throughout the Mongolian Empire. And that's where you get Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkestan, Turkmenistan. They're all these stans that used to be Mongolian, and now they're Islamic countries. Berke Khan declared war on Hulagu Khan for destroying the Islamic capital of Baghdad and rolling that caliph in that carpet. And the Muslim Tartar armies proceeded to capture the land of Rus, with the exception of Novgorod, because it was surrounded by swamps. The Novgorod Republic continued to flourish, and it was ruled by the citizens. Now, this is interesting. They had elections in Novgorod. In the city square, people gathered and shouted for their candidates, and the candidate that got the loudest supporters became the ruler. So they had elections in Novgorod, but it would be like, this guy, no, this guy. So the princes were still present in Novgorod, but they were, you can scroll a little bit more, but they were only hired military leaders to protect the city. The princes weren't in charge. And so again, this is a Christian area now. And I intersperse my books in there. That's one of my books, Rise of the Tyrant. And Novgorod's fate began to change when Ivan III of Moscow, known as Ivan the Great, expanded his domain. And then Ivan the Great took away 4/5 of the land of the Republic of Novgorod and deported its richest and ancient families. And then a century later is Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible. And he was cruel. He killed anybody who was suspected of being disloyal. He even killed his own son, the heir to the throne. So Ivan the Terrible was terrible. When Novgorod Republic was rumored to be seeking an alliance with Poland and Lithuania, Ivan attacked Novgorod with a vengeance. And Ivan's first command was to subjugate the church. Ivan the Terrible stripped the cathedrals and monasteries of all their valuables. He put the priests and deacons in shackles and flogged them till they paid a ransom. And he ordered some 500 clergy beaten to death. Ivan the Terrible laid waste to 90% of the farmland surrounding Novgorod. Ivan had 6,000 secret police called oprachniki, and they pillaged, burned, arrested, and terrorized with cruel violence. Ivan the Terrible's victims included men, women, and children. He roasted them on fires, tied them to sleds, dragged them through town, trapped them under ice in the Volkhov River, and if they managed to surface, they shoved them back under the ice. So he was terrible. According to the first Pskov Chronicle, an estimated 60,000 people were senselessly slaughtered by Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible's intentionally used force to force the people into submission, a tactic which replicated the French Revolution and their reign of terror. And anyway, you can skip past a couple paragraphs there. I just talk about, okay, Robespierre did the same thing in France, and they killed off of the leadership and they ruled through terror. Novgorod declined economically, finally lost its position being the only Russian port near the Baltic when Peter the Great began building St. Petersburg at the beginning of the 18th century. Peter the Great developed Russia's navy, increased the influence of Russia internationally. As a young man, Peter visited England to study shipbuilding. While there, he met William Penn. They conversed in a German language common to both. In April of 1698, Peter the Great attended a Quaker Friends meeting in England. And there's currently a Salvation Army shop there. Peter the Great visited the Quaker Friends meeting in Grace Church Street. London's Muscovy Street, the Tsar Street, were named after Peter's visit. William Penn writes to Peter the Great of Russia, said, "It was a profound respect and not a vain curiosity, great Tsar, which brought me twice to wait upon thee. If thou wouldst rule well, thou must rule for God, and to do that, thou must be ruled by him." William Penn continues, "Know, great Tsar, and take it with thee as one part of the collection of knowledge that thou art making in this unexampled travel, that 'tis in this kingdom of England that God has visited and touched the hearts of a people above 40 years ago by the holy light and at grace of his Son and our Savior, Jesus Christ, by which their minds have been turned from false worship and evil living to worship God, who is the Spirit, and by his own Spirit." Peter the Great sent the Danish explorer Vitus Bering to map the north coast of Siberia, and that's where they discovered the Bering Strait. And in 1710, Turks invaded Russia, and the new Turkish Grand Vizier defeated Peter the Great's Russian army in a Russian-Turkish war. Another notable Russian leader was Empress Catherine the Great, who helped America during the Revolutionary War by having Russia be one of the first major countries to recognize the United States. She refused Britain's request for Russian troops. Remember, Germany supplied German mercenary troops to the King of England, and she asked Russia for mercenary troops, and Catherine the Great said no. And she had Russia officially stay neutral during the Revolutionary War, which helped thwart Britain's blockade of American ports. After the American Revolution, Catherine the Great hired John Paul Jones to assist her navy in fighting the Turks. In the early 19th century, Tsar Alexander I defended Russia against Napoleon's invasion. And Napoleon had invaded Russia in June of 1812 with 600,000 men. After 6 months' blizzards, lack of food, bloody battles, Napoleon went back to France with 40,000. Think how many men he had died. Anyway, in 1856, Russia lost the Crimea War. Crimea is the bottom part of Ukraine. It's on the Black Sea. And at this time, the whole area is ruled by the Russian kingdom. And the Russians lose the Crimea, which had been part of the Turkish Empire. And anyway, when Tsar Alexander II lost, he did not want the British, who controlled Canada, to seize Alaska. So he sold it to the United States in 1867. And then during World War I, over 3 million Russians were killed fighting Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm, who used upgraded artillery and machinery. You read the story, I mean, there'd be literally thousands of Russian troops that would go to the front lines with these old muskets, and the Germans had machine guns and cannons and all kinds. And these troops, the one Russian general says, we couldn't even fire back. We're just going into the trenches and just getting killed. And 1 million soldiers died, so much so that that's why the Russians got upset at their czar and stood back when Lenin took over. The devastating loss of life undermined Tsar Nicholas II, led to his abdication and assassination in 1918. And then coming closer to the present, you have at the beginning of the 20th century, Vladimir Lenin seized power in Russia through the Bolshevik Revolution. He stated the goal of socialism is communism. When socialistic promises of abundance proved false, the people became disillusioned and disruptive. Lenin's godless government employed terror tactics to maintain power. And then Stalin seized power in 1922. And to control the masses of people, he notoriously used fear and food. People were kept in constant fear that the government agencies would falsely accuse them and cart them away in the night. So there's the fear. And then people were kept in continual food shortages intentionally, so that they could not have the resources to rebel. Now, let me pause here. Ukraine had lots of food. And so Stalin had his Russian army surround Ukraine and trucked out all the food. And people tried to immigrate on the roads. And Stalin had the Russian army surround all the roads in Ukraine so the people couldn't migrate to get out. And Stalin starved to death millions of Ukrainians. And so Stalin engineered a famine intentionally that killed millions in his war against kulaks, and the kulaks were self-sufficient farmers. Richard Pipes discussed in his book, Communism: A History, the terror tactics of Stalin to break the resistance of the peasants in the Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Kazakhstan. Stalin inflicted on these areas in 1932 to 33 an artificial famine, shipping out all the food from the entire districts, deploying an army to prevent starving peasants from migrating, and estimated that between 6 and 7 million people were killed by this man-made catastrophe. So you can begin to see some of the more modern-day roots of the animosity between the Ukrainians and the Russians. This is 1930s. I mean, this isn't like super ancient history that they experienced Stalin of Russia intentionally killing millions of Ukrainians. Franklin Roosevelt described the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. He goes, the Soviet Union is run by a dictatorship as absolute as any other dictatorship in the world. Union of Soviet Socialist Republics saw millions killed in purges. Karl Marx and Frederick Engels explained, conspirators by no means confine themselves to organizing. Their business consists in spurring it into artificial crises. They are alchemists of the revolution. So the part of Marxism is to create artificial crises. Stalin said, crises alone permitted the authorities to demand and obtain total submission of all the necessary sacrifices of its citizens. And so we begin to see during the Cold War a lot of effort on the Soviet side and then later on the CIA side of going into countries and intentionally creating crises to destabilize the countries so that they can overthrow the leadership and, install either a pro-West leader or install either a pro-Soviet leader. And so this period of 70 years is called the Cold War. And these tactics of going into countries and pitting people into groups and then pitting them against each other have been perfected. Stalin's regime, this is Richard Pipes wrote in Communism and History, Stalin's regime needed another crisis. As Fidel Castro, the leader of the communist Cuba, would explain, the revolution needs the enemy. The revolution needs for its development its antithesis. And if enemies were lacking, they had to be fabricated. Pipes continues, in 1934, a prominent Bolshevik, Sergei Kirov, the party boss of Leningrad, was assassinated under mysterious conditions. Evidence points to Stalin. Kirov was gaining too much popularity in the party ranks for Stalin's comfort. His assassination brought Stalin two advantages. It rid him of a potential rival and provided a rationale for instigating a vast campaign against alleged anti-Soviet conspirators. Purges of the 1930s were a terror campaign that in indiscriminate ferocity and the number of victims had no parallel in world history. Authorities beat them until they confessed to their crimes that they have not committed. Right? Sort of like the January 6th people that, being forced to, anyway. So socialist thinker Frederick Engels explained, every new crisis must be more serious than the last, ruin more small capitalists, increase the number of the unemployed. In the end, commercial crisis will lead to a social revolution. World War II, Russia invades Germany, and it's called the Eastern Front. It became the bloodiest theater in World War II, being considered the largest military confrontation ever and deadliest conflict in human history with an estimated 30 million deaths. And where was the biggest fighting? Sevastopol, which is the big city in Crimea. And so 200,000 killed or wounded. Franklin Roosevelt said, I saw Sevastopol and Yalta, and I know that there is not room enough on earth for both German militarism and Christian decency. So here, Sevastopol in Crimea, which is the southern area of what has been the nation of Ukraine, is this huge World War II battle between Russia and the Nazis. Terror tactics were used by the National Socialist Workers' Party. Franklin Roosevelt said, government to him, talking about Stalin, government to Stalin is not the servant of the people, but their absolute master and the dictator of every act. And philosophers question how people could commit these atrocities. And anyway, you can go on. I have some stuff about, the Nazi Nuremberg trials. And let's see here. Basically, if you get rid of God, anything's possible. There's no right. The state's in charge, and the state said there's no God, and so it's okay. So socialism is always a structured society, like a pyramid, where you have the dictator on top, and then the deep state party people running it, and then you have the poor people on the bottom. And so, let's see. You can keep scrolling down. Let's see whatever I have down there. How'd you like to live inside my head? It's pretty confusing. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He criticized Stalin, and he was arrested for it, and he spent 8 years in Gulag prison camps because he writes, you can scroll down, so Solzhenitsyn, there he's on the cover of Life magazine, he says, I was arrested on the grounds of what the censorship had found in my correspondence. Could you imagine the government censoring people? And with a school friend, mainly because of a certain disrespectful remark about Stalin, although we referred to him in disguised terms. A further basis for the charge were drafts of stories and reflections which had been found in my map case. Solzhenitsyn secretly wrote drafts, kept them carefully in hiding till they could be smuggled out of Russia, printed in France, and the title was The Gulag Archipelago. It was translated into 35 languages, sold 30 million copies, and for a result, Solzhenitsyn won the Nobel Prize, and the communist government basically kicked him out because of the international pressure. And he explained how Russia became a socialist dictatorship. So this is Solzhenitsyn. Over a half century ago, while I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of old people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Since then, I've spent well near nigh 50 years of working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I've read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That is why all this has happened. And he's reflecting a statement by the Russian author Dostoevsky in The Brothers Karamazov, where there's a character named Ivan Karamazov, and he says that if there is no God, everything is permitted. And one of America's founders, Patrick Henry, said, it is when people forget God that tyrants forge their chains. And so, Union of Soviet Social Republic lasted for 7 decades. It was the largest country in the world. It collapsed in 1991. It was called the arms race. So Ronald Reagan had the United States spend money on advancing our military, and Russia, Soviet Union tried to keep up, and they were taking so much money away from their GDP, away from their farming, away from their economy to build their weapons, that their economy cratered. Sort of ironic that we're doing to ourselves what we did to Russia, right? We're creating trillions of dollars out of nothing. We're creating trillions of debt, trillions of debt, trillions of debt. And anyway, so when Russia collapsed, 1991, out of it came 15 independent nations. Armenia, Moldova, Estonia, Latvia, down toward the bottom, you got Ukraine. All right, so Ukraine was one of the 15 nations that were formed out of the... So let's look at this. So here's David Lane, a friend of mine. He wrote in the American Renewal Project, a newsletter. He says, on January 10th, 1994, President Bill Clinton announced for the United States agreement with the Ukraine and Russia to dismantle Ukraine's entire nuclear arsenal. So Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. And when the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine is now its own country, and it just happens to have 1,900 nuclear weapons. And you can read down here a little bit further. So in other words, Ukraine was potentially the third biggest nuclear power in the world. And Bill Clinton gave assurances. Those assurances from Bill Clinton played a key role in persuading the Ukrainian government in Kiev to give up what amounted to the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, consisting of some 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads. In other words, Russia would never consider invading Ukraine if Ukraine had 1,900 nuclear missiles. But thanks to Bill Clinton, they took them all down. And then, you could fast forward. Here's Hillary Clinton giving Russia a fifth of the U.S. uranium in exchange for a $145 million Russian contribution to her Clinton Foundation. And then you have Biden canceling the Keystone Pipeline, and America goes from energy independent, and we end up buying billions of dollars a day worth of oil from Russia. And all this is emboldening Russia and viewing the U.S. President Biden as weak. On February 24th, 2022, an emboldened Vladimir Putin had the Russian military invade Ukraine. And every political analyst says this would never have happened under Trump. So basically what we're witnessing is Biden's war. And now this is, pause here for a second. We just went through 800 AD, right, all the way up to now. So is that 1,200 years? Anyway, so we went through a lot of history, and so here we are today. But there is an overarching thing, and that's globalists. and you have Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum, and he wants to have a one world government. And you have all these globalists meet in Davos, Switzerland, and they meet with the Council on Foreign Relations, they meet with the Trilateral Commission, and they have their little secret backroom meetings, and they're like, how can we get a one world government? And they basically need crises. So if they have the crises, and then the people panic and give up their freedoms to get past the crises. So if the government were to come to you and say, we want to track every one of your transactions, what would you say? No. And so, but if they want to be able to do that, they have to craft a way to do it. And so in my piecing together from my history, and I'll get into some of that in a moment, my piecing together of history is they need a bad guy to blame a crisis on. Now, it's a genuine, terrible, terrible crisis, but they need a crisis. So, oil is the number one commodity traded worldwide, and it's always been traded in US dollars. And so the US dollar is what's called the world's reserve currency. So all oil that's ever been traded has always been traded in US dollars. And Russia is the third largest supplier of oil. And so piecing it together, there's something called SWIFT, which is the agreement between international banks to do financial transactions. And with Russia and Putin being lured into, sort of like Saddam Hussein was lured to try to take Kuwait, and then the whole world comes against him, and George H.W. Bush says, well, this will be good. We'll be able to, out of this will come a new world order. Remember that speech? You know, it sort of got a lot of people's attention. And so here, Putin is lured to invade Ukraine, and now the whole world immediately says, we're going to cut them off financially. I mean, the coordination of it is like astounding that you could have all this coordinated effort cutting. And so what is Russia going to do? It's the third largest supplier of oil in the world. And if they're cut off from SWIFT and they're not able to trade, they'll be pushed to trade with China and sell oil in ruble yuan transactions, not using the US dollar. And then just 2 weeks ago, Saudi Arabia said, well, it would consider selling oil in other than US dollars. And you would have this domino effect of all these countries saying, yeah, we'll sell oil in another exchange rather than the US dollar. Once that happens, the US dollar will lose its position as the world's reserve currency. And there will be trillions of dollars that have already been created that nobody will need. And they'll all come home, chasing the same amount of goods. And the price of everything will skyrocket astronomically. So you have $1,000 in the bank and it'll be worth $1. And I'm praying this doesn't happen, and I pray we repent and God can put the whole thing off. But you read Klaus Schwab, and he says, yeah, by 2030, you will own nothing, but you'll be happy. You know, so we have a very powerful person saying, look, we want to get it to a place where nobody owns anything. And so if it takes $1,000 to fill up your car of gas, who's got $1,000 in their pocket? But we all buy stuff with electronic transactions. And so Biden just 2 weeks ago signed a digital dollar legislation. And over 100 countries have signed digital dollar legislation, which is a federally controlled Bitcoin. Yeah. And because everything's financial transactions electronically, it's very easy for banks to just say, okay, instead of using the dollar unit, we're going to use another unit, but it's still electronic. So it doesn't matter how many zeros are after the one. You can still do transactions. And then there's thought that the US government will give everybody an account and put some stimulus money into it that you can spend. And at first it'll be nice, right? You can still spend it, but they'll track everything. And they have the ability to program this digital currency so it cannot be spent on items that the government doesn't want it to be spent on. So if you go to a certain place, then you pull out your card and it's not going to work. But if you go to someplace else, it does work, right? They can program the currency, and then they can shut it off at any time they want. Like a lady in Canada gave $50 to that Freedom Convoy, and then all of a sudden her bank account didn't work anymore. And so in addition to your credit score, they're going to have a social credit score that'll be combined with it. And China has this already. And so they keep track of everything you buy, whether it's, with your credit card, they know exactly what you buy. You buy online, they know what you buy. They keep track of all your Google searches. I talked to a guy that does all this. They know how long you are viewing every web page. That data is available. And then with cameras and then geo-positioning on your phone, they'll know where you go and who you're around. And in China, if they can geo-position and find out that you're in the vicinity of people with low credit scores, your credit score goes down. And so it'll alert you that you're around somebody, so you'll back away from them. And so in America, they're calling it ESG, which stands for environmental, socially woke, and governance or something. But it's going to be examining all of your social life and then putting that score in with your credit score to see if your currency is going to work or not. Now, again, I'm praying this doesn't happen, and I'm praying we repent, and God can put the whole thing off a generation if he wants. But if you look at what they're planning, these things are being talked about on a big level. There's a friend of mine named Kevin Freeman, and he has the Economic War Room, and it's a program on the Glenn Beck Network. And he was explaining to me index funds. And so 10 years ago, they started where they would invest in everything on Wall Street and just take advantage of that eventual everything goes up. And so it's very safe. It's not risky at all. And you end up, taking advantage of this increase in the stock market gradually goes up all the time. And so people put their retirement accounts with asset management people that invested in these index funds. The biggest ones are BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And since you own maybe a couple shares of Exxon with your retirement, you're not going to drive across the country and go to an Exxon stockholder meeting. You don't even know what you're going to do when you're there, And so what do you do? You check the little proxy box, and you give that vote to the asset management company, which is the BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. So they show up at the Exxon stockholder meeting, and they have so many proxy votes from all these people's retirement accounts invested with them that they just dictate what's going to happen. And they say, we want you to fire that person. We want you to put this diverse person on the board, this woke person, this climate change person. We want you to push diversity. We want you to push transgender. We want you to have training for everybody in your company to push all this alternative sexual stuff. And the employees of the company have to do what the stockholders decide. And the stockholders are these. And so we've always thought of Coke and Pepsi as competitors. Well, you look at who owns the most of the stock of Coke, it's BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. Who owns most of Pepsi? BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. We've always thought of General Mills and Nestle as competitors. Who owns most of them? BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. Look at who owns the most of the pharmaceutical companies, most of the communication companies, most of the media companies. These three companies control trillions of dollars. Never before in the history of the world has more money than entire nations been controlled by just a handful of individuals. And you add together with that, Bill Gates, George Soros, Bezos, Warren Buffett. A very small group of people control an unbelievable amount of money, and they're all woke, and they're all pro-China, and they all don't like our values. So I just thought I'd come and give you a little encouragement tonight. That's why I don't know if you heard me this morning, but it's like, that's why I focus on how big God is, right? And God not only stretched out the universe, he holds it in existence. I mean, the observable universe is 93 billion light years across, and God is holding it in existence this very moment. The same God that created you, that's inside of you by the power of his Holy Spirit. And when you focus on that, then it's like, God's got this. I mean, what's the Our Father? Our Father who art in heaven. And heaven, right? There's the heaven of the presence of the Lord, but it's also the heavens he created. 93 billion light years. I mean, every single galaxy. And guess what? The universe is still expanding at the speed of light. Yes. And it's the speed of light that direction and the speed of light that direction. So it's really expanding faster than the speed of light. Yes. And Einstein said, if you travel the closer you can travel to traveling the speed of light, for you time slows down. Theory of relativity, right? And if you could travel the speed of light, for you time would stand still. And since God created light, he's obviously faster than light. So for God, every moment, right, it says a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. You know, they've got computers now, they call them quantum computers, and they use qubits rather than just bits, and it's a little 8-sided little, whatever it is, a molecule, and it has to be cooled down to absolute zero, because if it's just a degree more than that, the qubit resonates and it loses its coherence. But they're able to do computers that, I mean, it's hundreds of millions of dollars, and they have them in China, and they have them in Saudi Arabia, they have them, you know, in America, but these computers can do 1 billion times 1 billion calculations a second. And if man can make something that can do 1 billion times 1 billion computations a second, you think God's faster? Yeah. God can do infinity times infinity calculations per second. Now, most of these quantum computers are used predictively. And they want to basically take all the data about all the humans and predict what they're going to do. It's also, they're using it for climate change and predicting this. And it's where you have multiple variables and you're trying to be predictive. And I mean, it's, but the idea if man can do that, certainly God's faster, right? So for God, every moment basically stands still. So we all get to make our little free will decisions. But God, in every moment, he can rearrange every atom in the universe if necessary, so that his will is going to take place before everything goes to the next frame. And then we all make our little decisions, and then he can readjust everything, and right, he controls time. So his will is going to take place. And we're sort of walking in slow motion compared to God, you know? And so his will is going to take place. And so when we see what's happening in the world, we have to remind ourselves that God's in control and he has a purpose. And the purpose is that he wants us to turn to him. And I mentioned this morning about free will. God loves you. He wants you to love him back. He doesn't need your love. He's not incomplete in any way, and your love completes him. No, he is complete all by himself. He doesn't need your love, but he wants it. Parents don't need the love of their children, but they want it. Right? God doesn't need your love, but he wants it, and he created you for the very purpose of you being able to love him. You know, I looked up the word angel in the Bible, in the King James. The word angel is mentioned 289 times. Never once does it say that the angels love God. It says they worship him, they glorify him, they praise him, they honor him. They carry out his messages, they smite his enemies. But angels are not made in the image of God, and Jesus didn't die on the cross to redeem angels. But you look at man in the Bible, it's love everywhere. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Right? Jesus turns to Peter. Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Right? This is, you know, whatever you do to the least of my brethren, you do. It's love. God created us to be able to love him. And love must be voluntary. So he won't force us. The moment God would force you to love him, he himself would know he's forcing you to love him, and he would know your response is not a love response because he knew that he forced it. So he intentionally does not force you. But he does like the power of a pull of a magnet. He can pull upon your heart. Right? And you've sensed it, right? This gentle pull of the Holy Spirit. And so he has the two different positive and negative motivations. The first one is he blesses you so much, you turn to him out of gratefulness. But if that doesn't work, he has plan B. He hides his face. That's what it says in Deuteronomy. If you sin against me, that I'll hide my face. He hides his face, and he lets us experience the consequences of our own selfish decisions. And then we turn to him out of desperation saying, help! And he's there to help us, right? His goal is to have us turn to him, right? And if we don't turn to him when things are good, he doesn't want us to be forever separated from him. And so he will allow the situations to get to such, but he still won't force you. Now, most people, when the situation gets really bad, at some point they'll say, okay, God, I'm just going to surrender to you. But some people harden their hearts. And the more it gets bad, the harder they get. And they're like, okay. You know, I was trying to think of an example. You have a credit card, and the credit card has a chip. There's no battery in the credit card. The credit card cannot do anything by itself. But you go to the store, you put all the items you want to purchase, and you stick the chip in the card reader. The bank sends an electronic signal to the store, to the cash register, to the card reader, and sends that electric charge to this chip. All the chip has to do is respond. And the transaction is made, and I walk out with the goods. But if this chip is damaged, no transaction is made. Your heart is like this chip. And the gospel message comes from God, right? It comes through a preacher, and it comes to your heart. God loves you. He wants you to love him back. All you got to do is respond to his love. All you got to do is say, okay, Lord, I yield to you. I'm yours. And the transaction of salvation is made. And you get to be saved and spend eternity with him. But if you harden your heart, it says in the gospel, today, if you hear his voice, harden not your heart. Today, if he sends his signal to your chip, just respond. Say, God, I yield to you. I'm yours. I surrender myself to you. Isn't that beautiful? Well, wasn't exactly the direction I was thinking of going tonight. How much time do I have? Should I talk some more? I don't know. You want me to keep talking? And well, tell you what, Johnny. If you could flip to my presentation, and then I have like lots of slides. Go down to one where it's like 2/3 of the way through, and it says how to brainwash a nation. And I'll tell you about that as soon as he gets to it. But while he's getting to that, the first part of my presentation, I go through how, oh, you're fast, wow, is crises. So the most common form of government in world history is kings. Democracies and republics are ways to take power of a king, give it to the people. But what if the king wants the power back? Does he just go to the people and say, hi, give me control of your life? No, that's not how it works. So there's two ways when people give up power over their life. One is fear, the other is free stuff. When people are in fear, they'll trade their freedom for security. And so you have a whole bunch of political philosophers throughout history that talk about getting people into fear. They even have a term for it. It's called fear-mongering. The intentional creating of an atmosphere of fear so people will give up their freedoms, fear-mongering. And the other is free stuff. And that's basically the Great Reset. In other words, a thief can come into your house from the front door or the back door. Right? And so the front door is it comes in with violence and the communists take over, but the back door is where they get you to sign up for welfare, for money from the government, and then you get dependent upon it. It's sort of like a drug dealer takes over a neighborhood two ways. He can come in with guns and shoot, and everybody panics in fear and agrees to give the mob whatever they want just to be left alive. But the other is the gang can come in, and they're so nice they give away free drugs. And then people take it and get hooked. And then they said, oh, you want some more free drugs? You're going to sell yourself into prostitution and kill your neighbor, right? And so the idea is, how do you get people to give up control of their life to the government? It's getting them into an atmosphere of fear, and then getting them to receive free stuff from you, and then get dependent. And so those two methods have been used throughout history. I talk about Machiavelli 500 years ago. Italy was a bunch of city-states. And, well, before that, I talk about Abimelech. And tell you what, Johnny, do you want to try to find the Abimelech picture? While he's doing that. So you have Lucifer. Imagine being in heaven. And in heaven, you have a wonderful, everybody's, and then somebody sows discord. Somebody's complaining. Somebody sows discord in heaven. His name's Lucifer. And he gets 1/3 of the angels to rebel. He's cast out. And then Lucifer comes into the garden, and he sows discord, and he gets Adam to blame Eve. And he sows discord. He gets Cain to kill Abel. And now we got the nation of Israel. For 400 years, there's no king. and you have Gideon just defeated 100,000 Midianites. And so there's peace in Israel. I mean, no threat. They defeated 100,000 Midianites, so there's no peace. But Gideon has an illegitimate son named Abimelech. And Abimelech decides he wants to seize power. So Abimelech is the first one on record to do critical race theory, identity race politics, to do what? To sow discord. So he goes to the city of Shechem and he says, "This is better for you that all the sons of Gideon reign over you. Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh." And his brethren spake of him in the ears of all the men of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, "He is our brother." And so they're backing Abimelech, not because he's good at ruling, but because he's one of us. So it's identity politics. Abimelech then goes to the city treasury and hires protesters, rioters, right? Takes money and hires them. It says, "And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, wherewith Abimelech hired vain and worthless persons, Antifa-type crowds, which followed him. And they went into his father's house at Ophrah, and they committed violence. They slew his brethren. And then the men of Shechem made Abimelech king." So we have this model. We've got peaceful nation, no threats. Somebody wants to take control, and they sow division on the inside. They do this identity politics. They take money to hire rioters. They commit violence, and then in the panic confusion, they seize power and become king. Now, Israel's republic would have ended here rather than a century later with King Saul, had not someone threw a millstone over the wall and it killed Abimelech. But let's fast forward to Machiavelli, Italy, 500 years ago, bunch of city-states that all fought. And Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end, because it'll stop the infighting, that any means necessary to get there is justified. Light, cheat, steal. So if a prince conquers a city, the people in the city would hate him. But if the prince hires criminals like Abimelech did to kill cows and smash windows and set things on fire, the people will panic in fear, cry out for some help, and the prince can come in and get rid of the very criminals he paid to create the problem. Nobody will know the better for it, and everyone will praise the prince as a hero. So it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it. You go around the back of the house and set it on fire, then you go around the front of the house and sell them a fire extinguisher. And they'll pay anything for it and even thank you for being there. So it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on crises to consolidate control. I mean, it's literally a plan to create fear. And then when people are in fear, they will want somebody to come along and restore order. And it is interesting that the Bible over and over again says, "Fear not, fear not." I think every book in the Bible, somewhere in there, it says, "Fear not." Like 365 times in the Bible, "Fear not, fear not." And yet the devil wants to get us into fear. And once we're in fear, we panic and want to trade freedom for security. That's why I put on the armor of God. It says, quenching all the fiery darts of the wicked one. What's a fiery dart? That's this overwhelming emotion that things are terrible and that you're right at the verge of just collapsing and giving up. But if you just put up the shield of faith and say, "I'm going to stay in faith. I don't know how, but I'm going to trust God to get me through this mess." Well, the next day, you've made it through a day. And then you made it through 2 days, and you made it through pretty soon. You made it through a week, you made it through a month, and then you look back and it's, "Oh, that wasn't that bad." But it says when the enemy comes in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord raises a standard against it. The enemy comes in like a flood. They actually have a military term for it called shock and awe. It's where you want to give this perception that is overwhelming and the enemy just caves. But if you just say, "No, I'm not going to cave," even though all my senses are telling me this lawsuit, this divorce, this crisis, this health doctor's report, I mean, all of it comes in and it looks absolutely horrible. And your first thought is to cave. But if you just say, "Wait, I'm going to trust God." And then a day goes by, and then 2 days, you keep trusting God, trusting God, trusting God. Then you make it through. But it's interesting because what we're experiencing is an intentional, organized process to get you into fear. And anyway, Rahm Emanuel talks about never let a crisis go to waste, and I'm going to skip past some stuff. So you and I see a crisis, our response is how can we help people through it? They see a crisis, their response is how can we usurp power through it? And let's see here. The British Empire became the biggest empire in the world. Do you think they just walked into a country and said, "Hi, we're here to become the biggest empire in the world, so give us control of your country"? Okay, yeah, here you go. Is that how it works? No, let's see. How did the British take over India? They landed in Bengal in 1714 and opened a trading post that turned into a trading fort that turned into them having guns. And then they would go to one kingdom and give them guns, and another kingdom and give them guns, and then stir up discord between the kingdoms and stir up ancient animosities until they broke out into fighting each other. And when they bloodied each other up really good, the British would come in and conquer both and take away all their guns, and did this again and again and again until the British took over all of India, a quarter of the world's population. They tried doing it in America during the Revolutionary War. British General Johnny Burgoyne, coming down from Canada, meets with the Mohawk Indians and promises them money for scalps. And so the Mohawks would go in front of the British Army and scalp the Americans. It happened so much that it's mentioned in the Declaration. It says, the king has excited domestic insurrections among us. He has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of ages, sexes, and conditions. So here you have the King of England coming over here, and the Americans and the Indians had reached an equilibrium. We sort of, got along, and they were stirring up the Indians intentionally. And they did it again during the War of 1812. I mentioned that at least in one of the services this morning. Fort Mims, Alabama, the historical marker here, Creek Indian War, took place the most brutal massacre in American history. Indians took the fort with heavy loss, then killed all but 36 of the some 550 in the fort. Creeks had been armed by British at Pensacola in this phase of the War of 1812. Do we really think the British cared about the Indians? No, they were wanting to give them guns, stir them up to attack, because they wanted to conquer all of America. And Washington warned in his farewell address, disorders, discord, right, miseries, gradually get people into fear and gradually incline the minds of men to seek security in the absolute power of an individual who turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Jealousy, false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasional riot, insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through party passions. Now, back then, you had the British coming in saying, hey, we'll help you against the other side. The French would come in and say, we'll help you against the other side. But now you got China coming to a political party and saying, hey, we'll give you some money. It's like, oh, really? You want to help us? No, they want to take over the whole thing. And you have Russia giving money to Hillary Clinton, right? $145 million. And so Washington's farewell address. This is his final goodbye warning. Let there be no change by usurpation. What's usurpation? That's the government taking away your freedoms, and you let them because they're telling you that they're doing it for your good. So he goes, encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all departments in one to create a real despotism. Usurpation, though in one instance, may be the instrument of good. It is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. I think this is one of the most powerful lines in Washington's farewell address. Usurpation, though in one instance may be the instrument of good. It's the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So in other words, when you have a disorder, a misery, a crisis, a pandemic, and you have a leader coming to you and saying, look, I'm going to usurp some of your power, some of your rights and freedoms, but I'm doing this for your good. And they want to say, I want to do an instrument of good. Washington says, that's how you destroy a free country. In a disorder, in a crisis, some politician saying, I want to do an instrument of good, but I need to usurp a little power to do it. That's how you destroy the country. Usurpation must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any transient temporary benefit which the use can't at any time yield. So we look at Europe. Napoleon conquered, 6 million die in the Napoleonic Wars. Afterwards, the king of Prussia, a German kingdom, says we got to strengthen the state. He gets a philosopher named Hegel, who influenced Darwin and who influenced Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a student at the University of Berlin, and he was a member of the Young Hegelians, a radical student group that followed Hegel. Hegel had something called dialectics. It's a triangle, one corner thesis, opposite corner an antithesis, top corner a synthesis. It sounds complicated, but it's not. So Marx applied this where the thesis is the status quo. It's the way things are in the country, and everybody's just getting along the way they've always gotten along. And he says you have to create an antithesis. You have to create a problem. You have to sow discord. You have to create a problem that's so bad everybody panics in fear and is willing to give up their freedoms to somebody promising to bring order. And that's when you usurp power and you take control. Well, then that synthesis becomes the new thesis starting point, and you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody panics in fear and gives up some more of their freedoms to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. Then you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody panics in fear and trades some more freedom for security for an answer that's just half as bad. And every time they settle, they give up a little of their individual freedom to the state. And so Karl Marx says, how do you create a problem that's real bad? How do you create an antithesis? You have to send in agitators, agent provocateurs, community organizers, labor organizers. They go into a country and they find all the groups with grievances, stir them up to riot. And when everybody panics in fear, that's when you usurp power. And so Karl Marx called this critical theory. And you observe a country and see all the groups, economically, religiously, ethnically. And you call some victims and others oppressors, some haves and others have-nots, and you pit them against each other to create riots. And when everybody panics in fear, you usurp power and take control. So originally it was called critical economic theory. And he would organize the proletariat against the bourgeois, which is the working class against the business owners, the poor against the rich. And then it was critical racial theory. You organized blacks against whites. Then it was religious theory. You organized the Catholics against the Protestants, the Muslims against the Christians. They even organized the Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo and Rwanda. So the people in Congo and Rwanda saw themselves as one, but the Belgian and German colonizers come in and measure them and their features, and they say, you're a Hutu and you're a Tutsi. They literally create artificial racial distinctions that had not been there before. And then they pit them against each other and sow discord until they start killing each other and even genocide each other. And then the colonizing power comes in to restore order and takes control of the whole thing. Could you imagine the government breaking people into groups just to pit them against each other? You know, and anyway. So Castro said the revolution needs the enemy. The revolutionary needs his antithesis, which is the counter-revolutionary. And if enemies were lacking, they had to be fabricated. In other words, to do this triangle, you need an enemy. You can't organize your people against nothing to give up power, right? So you have to create an enemy, maybe even create out of nothing, like a white supremacist or a white nationalist. Or you create some group that really doesn't exist, but you need an enemy to organize against to get people into fear, to have an excuse to have them give up their freedoms. And Jesus said, if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. So this is what Satan did, right? He tried to sow division in heaven. He sowed division in the garden with Adam, blame, and Eve, and Cain, kill, and Abel. Sowed division in Israel with Abimelech, right, going into Shechem. Sows a division with Machiavelli, right? Sows division with the British taking over kingdoms and sowing the division between them. This is sort of the standard way that you take over. And it's introducing an autoimmune disease into the body politic. What's an autoimmune disease? That's where your own body attacks your own body. Your immune system goes haywire and begins to attack your own organs. And so the body politic, you want to get the body to divide and attack itself inside of the country. I mean, how do you destroy a marriage? You divide them against each other. How do you destroy a family? You divide against each other. How do you destroy a church? You divide against each other. How do you destroy a country? You divide against each other. This is what Satan does. And so the critical race theory is patriotism is the enemy. Stop identifying as citizens of the country and get everybody to identify with subgroups and then pit the subgroups against each other to commit violence and get everybody in fear. And when they're in fear and there's random violence, people knee-jerk reactions, surrender their freedoms to somebody promising to restore order. FDR said, whoever seeks to set one nationality against another seeks to degrade all nationalities. Whoever seeks to set one race against another seeks to enslave all races. The so-called racial voting blocks are creation of designing politicians who profess to be able to deliver them on election day. FDR said, remember the Nazi technique, pit race against race, religion against religion, prejudice against prejudice, divide and conquer. Charles Barkley, the NBA player on CBS Sports Panel, April 3rd, 2021, said, man, I think most white people and black people are great people. I really believe that in my heart. But I think our system is set up where our politicians, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, are designed to make us not like each other so they can keep their grasp of money and power. They divide and conquer. He goes on, we're so stupid following our politicians. Their only job is, hey, let's make the whites and blacks not like each other. Let's make the rich and poor not like each other. Let's scramble the middle class. I truly believe that in my heart. Even Malcolm X, 1963, said the white liberal differs from the white conservative. Both want power. But the white liberal has perfected the art of posing as the Negro's friend and benefactor, to use the Negro as a pawn or a weapon in this political football game, and the white liberal controls the ball. Now, how did these tactics begin to come to America? 1894, Chicago has a railroad car company, Pullman, and they employ all kinds of workers, and then the economy goes down. Orders for railroad cars drop off, and they can't pay the workers. And so somebody comes to organize the workers who have grievances, and his name is Eugene Debs. He's an organizer, and he organizes them. Bernie had his picture on the wall. He organizes them to protest and riot and commit violence, and they destroy $80 million worth of railroad cars, and it spreads to 27 states. And since everything in America is shipped over the railroad, the entire country is paralyzed. Could you imagine organizing, rioting, and burning, and all kinds of fighting going from city to city all across America? And then Eugene Debs started the Socialist Party of America. And he ran for president 5 times between 1900 and 1920, 1 time from prison. And then in 1920, branching off as the Communist Party USA, and they run candidates for president every year from 1920 to 1940. What happened in 1940? Democrat President Franklin Roosevelt makes a treaty with Stalin during World War II. And the Communist Party says, why should we be running our own candidates? Let's just back the Democrat candidates, because here FDR is making treaties with Stalin. And so they began to infiltrate that party. And even Ronald Reagan, who was a Democrat, said, I didn't leave the Democrat Party, the party left me. Years ago, I met Zell Miller. He was the last pro-life Democrat U.S. Senator. And he said, unfortunately, the National Democratic Party has been taken over by the very liberal, left-wing, leaning special interest groups in Washington. But lest we think they only want to take over one party, Albert Herlong, a congressman in 1963, read into the congressional record 45 tactics the communists were going to use to try to take over America. And one of them was capture one or both political parties. And they've made great headways, because it takes lots of money for politicians to get elected. And when you have people like George Soros and Bezos and Bill Gates and these different ones with lots of money, and you have these BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard that are owning the companies, and the politicians go to the company and say, hey, give me some PAC donations, you know? And the company says, okay, we're going to back this candidate, not the other. And the candidate says, okay, I need the money to run, so okay, I'll change what I stand for. I'll still give a conservative speech, but I'll change when I get to voting time. I'll come up with some excuse to not vote conservative, right? But just give me your money, right? The Bible says, be careful who you take a bribe from, because a bribe will turn the heart of those that take it. So unfortunately, our system is set up so that politicians have to go and ask for bribes, basically, right? And so you get a lot of money from few people or little bits of money from lots of people, right? And so that's why the candidates that have little bits of money from lots of people, they're not controlled by the fewer handful. Anyway, Albert Herlong also says, resist any attempt to outlaw the Communist Party, do away with loyalty oaths or pledges of allegiance. Let's look at, so we talked about 1894 Chicago Pullman Railroad car strike, but let's go to 1920 in Germany. It was a republic at that time, the Weimar Republic. And a party was started called the National Socialist Workers' Party, and the head of it was Hitler. And this party, even though it was a political party, it had a violent, under-the-table arm to it. They were the brown shirts. They were nicknamed Sturmabteilung, or stormtroopers, because they would storm into the meetings of Hitler's opponents and disrupt the meeting and shout down the speakers. And then they would lock arms and block access to public buildings. Could you imagine people locking arms in public and like blocking things? And then they were blocking streets and roads. Who would do that? And then they went into the cities and they smashed the windows and looted and set on fire over 7,500 stores owned by Jews in the night of broken glass. And then their capital got set on fire, right? An insurrection. It was the burning of the Reichstag, and evidence points to Hitler's own people setting the fire. But in the confusion, Hitler decided to do investigations and to detain people and to arrest them and to have them shot without a trial. And when the dust settled, Hitler didn't have any political opponents left. And Germany transitioned from a republic to a dictatorship. And Stalin did a similar thing. I referred to this before, but I'll go through a little better detail. In 1934, Stalin faced a growing anti-Stalinist movement, and he had a popular supporter, Sergei Kirov, the party boss of Leningrad, who's giving speeches praising Stalin. They even built a statue to Sergei. He was so popular. So Stalin had an idea. He would assassinate his friend, Sergei Kirov, and eliminate a potential rival. And he would blame the assassination on the anti-Stalinists and use it as an excuse to do investigations and round them up and kill over 1 million people in the first Great Purge in 1936 to 38. Literally doing the attack and the crime and blaming it on these innocent opponents and using it as an excuse to kill your opponents. Erdogan did a similar thing in Turkey, right? He got in an airplane, flew in a circle and landed and claimed there was a coup against him, and he pulls out a list of 30,000 of his political opponents, has them arrested, zip-tied, taken away, and they've not been seen since, right? And Tucker Carlson showed this video of the very first people breaking into the U.S. Capitol. And they come in, and I talked to a guy that does military stuff. He says, what they're doing in the door with the one guy there and the one guy in the other direction, one guy there, says, this is a planned operation here. And they're all dressed in black, and there were no group of people all dressed in black at the Trump rally. It sort of doesn't look like people that heard a speech and got riled up and decided that they were going to march over to the Capitol. This looks like it was planned. And then it comes out that there are FBI operatives in the crowd. Yeah. And then we find out, if you've ever been to D.C., they have these big, heavy metal, bulletproof doors that have huge, powerful magnets at the top. And the only way to get in is to be buzzed in from the inside. The doors open from the inside. And then you have a guy named Ray Epps, and he's on camera the night before saying, we got to break into the Capitol, we got to break into the Capitol. And the people surround him saying, Fed, you're an inside operative, right? They're calling him out. And out of all the FBI lists of people they want to round up, his name isn't on there, right? I mean, here he's on the film. And so the evidence points to him being an FBI operative in the crowd, stirring them up. It's called an entrapment. And so that's the way they would go from drug dealers, and they'd catch them in the crime, but then they'd get somebody into the drug gang, so they'd be there when they do the crime. Then it would be somebody in there that would plan it and organize it and capture them in the act. Sort of like the kidnapping of the Michigan Governor Whitmer. And they find out that basically half the people that were involved were FBI. They organized it, they paid for it, they called these low IQ people saying, you got to be there, and one of the reports said they even drugged them to get them there. And then they said, we caught this plot that they were behind the whole time. Anyway, and here's a New York Times staff person caught on video saying that it was a fake trauma, fake news full of FBI informants. And so in psychology, it's called psychological projection, where the attacker blames the victim, or blame shifting. Karl Marx says, accuse others of what you do. Little kids do this. I didn't start the fight, you did, right? And so George Orwell called it doublespeak, but it's basically you accuse your opponent of what you're guilty of. David Axelrod, a former campaign advisor, said, in Chicago, there was an old tradition of throwing a brick through your own campaign office window and then calling a press conference to say you've been attacked. Right? So you do the crime, you blame it on your opponent. Sort of like if there's a candidate colluding with Russia, giving away 1/5 of the U.S. uranium in exchange for $145 million. She wants to pay for a Steele dossier to accuse her opponent of colluding with Russia. Yeah. And his name gets associated with it in the media, and most people only read the subject line of the email, and they think guilt by association. And if it ever gets pointed back at her, by that time, the water's muddied. The public doesn't know who to trust, and she gets a pass. Let's say there's another candidate extorting Ukraine, saying, stop investigating my son, or I'm going to hold back billions of dollars of U.S. aid. You want to accuse your opponent of extorting Ukraine. The exact crime you're guilty of, you accuse them of, because then their name gets associated with it, right? And then the investigation process is simply an excuse to subpoena all the evidence that can convict them and destroy it. All the servers and laptops and hard drives and text messages and emails and cell phones, just smash, smash, smash. You're destroying the evidence, right? And anyway, after World War II, can you sort of see a timeline? I know I'm sort of skipping around, But so after World War II, Germany, France, and England give up all their former colonies. And so they start brand new countries with brand new leaders. And they're climbing out of the post-war crisis, and it looks hopeful, except the Soviet Union decides to do critical theory. And they send their agents into the countries to observe all the groups and categorize them. Ethnically, Bosnians, Croats, Serbs; religiously, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox; economically, racially, doesn't matter. And they would call some victims and others oppressors, haves and have-nots. And then they would organize protests that they'd escalate into riots and violence. Why violence? Because then people think emotionally and not rationally. And then they co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame the new leader of the new country for all the problems. They nurture weak links in the military, and when the country gets panicky and confused enough, they do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. And so after World War II, country after country is falling to the communists. And it's called Behind the Iron Curtain. And in the Far East, you got Mao Zedong doing the same thing in China. He tweaks it a little bit. He calls it continuous revolution theory. So instead of doing that triangle, that thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and then you do it again, instead of doing that a couple times to seize power and stopping, he says, no, even after you seize power, you continue to have crises. So you have a crisis and you take the land from the rich, and then you have another crisis, you take the land from the middle class, then you have another crisis, you take the land from the poor. You just keep having crises. It's sort of like a continuous pandemic, right? Another variant, another variant, another variant. They want to milk this thing for all it's worth. They want to get as much out of this. And so Truman does nothing when all these countries are going behind the Iron Curtain, and because he thinks the United Nations he helped form will bring world peace, but the next president's Eisenhower. And Eisenhower says the United Nations has seemed to be two distinct things to the two worlds divided by the Iron Curtain. To the free world, it seems that it should be a constructive forum. To the communist world, it has been a sounding board for their propaganda, a weapon to be exploited in spreading disunity, discord, and confusion. So Eisenhower's choice is do nothing or do something. And he decides he's going to fight fire with fire. And so when Iran sides with the Soviet Union in 1953, their leader, Mossadegh, nationalizes the country's oil industry. What does that mean? It means he takes control of it all. And you think, well, big deal, Iranian oil. It's like, wait a second, Britain has no oil fields. So in 1908, Britain formed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You know it better as BP. British Petroleum is really the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Right, there's the sign when they're switching the name in 1954. Right, take down the Anglo-Iranian, put up the British. And so when Mossadegh seizes all of the BP assets, Britain is facing an oil shortage. So they appeal to Eisenhower for help, and Eisenhower approves the first CIA operation to overthrow a country's leader. It's Operation Ajax. And the CIA operative on the ground is Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. He's an expert in foreign languages. He goes to Tehran, and he does the KGB thing in reverse. He organizes mobsters and gangsters and radical imams and stages protests and riots and attacks mosques and co-opts the media with bribes and threats to blame Mossadegh for all the problems and nurtures weak links in the military. And when the country's panicky enough, they put Mossadegh under house arrest, lock him away for the rest of his life where he dies, and they replaced him with the Shah, who loved America because we helped put him in. And the CIA did the same thing in Guatemala. We didn't want Guatemala to side with the Soviets, and we did the same thing in the Congo, Dominican Republic, South Vietnam, Brazil, Chile. And the KGB did the same thing, with Brezhnev and Khrushchev helping Yasser Arafat to start the PLO for one purpose: sow division in the Middle East. And they helped Castro take over Cuba by sowing division. And they had hundreds of coup attempts in Africa, and they had the ELN in Bolivia. And there it is. They had Brezhnev and Khrushchev helped Che Guevara start FARC in Colombia and ELN in Bolivia for the purpose of sowing division, breaking them into groups, pitting the groups against each other, and then when there's panicky enough, they seize power. And so this period of time is called the Cold War. And these tactics have been perfected and perfected and perfected. The only difference this time around is we are experiencing them done on our own soil against us. right? So under the Obama administration, a lot of federal agencies were politicized. What does that mean? That means that the IRS began to target conservative groups. That's right. And the NSA and the intelligence gathering community was being used to dig up dirt on political enemies of that administration. And we began to see a lot of these tactics that had been used on foreign soil for an ostensible patriotic purpose. We don't want those countries to be in the Soviet orbit, so it's okay for us to use these tactics to keep them in our orbit, but now we see them used against us. I thought it was interesting, the Cold War, Chris Matthews said, I remember the Cold War. This is after a Democrat candidate debate and the subject of socialism came up. He says, I've seen what socialism is like, and I don't like it, okay? It's not only not free, it doesn't work. I believe if Castro and the Reds had won, there would have been executions in Central Park. Do you know this was Chris Matthews' last time on TV? He must have said something that they didn't like. And anyway, Castro had an executioner named Che Guevara. Che Guevara wrote, we executed many people by firing squad without knowing if they were fully guilty. I'd like to confess, I discovered that I really like killing. Blind hate against the enemy creates a forceful impulse that cracks the boundaries of natural human limitations, transforming the soldier into an effective, selective, cold-killing machine. A people without hate cannot triumph. So that's where you do this thesis, antithesis. You have to get one side to hate the other side, and then you take advantage of that division. A little closer to home, Chicago. Al Capone has a hitman named Frank Nitti, and he had a young guy travel around with him named Saul Alinsky. And Saul Alinsky observed that all they had to do was kill a few people, smash a few windows, and the whole neighborhood would panic in fear and agree to trade freedom for security. And they'd pay the mob extortion protection money to be left alive. And Saul Alinsky decided to apply that to politics, to create a crisis. And so Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis at Wellesley College on Saul Alinsky. And Saul Alinsky says the first step in community organization is community disorganization. Disruption of the present organization is the first step. The organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent. Fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. The organizer polarizes the issue, helps lead his forces into conflict. He must search out controversy, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. This is the politics we have been experiencing in America for the last generation. It's actually got a name. It's called race baiting or fear-mongering. It's the intentional stirring up of passion to be able to harness that passion for a political purpose of sowing division. Then you can usurp power, promising an answer. Now, if you have a copy of Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals, I do. In the front is an acknowledgement to Lucifer. Lest we forget, at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment, did it so effectively he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. Remember we started off with that? You're in heaven, it's nice and peaceful, and somebody's sowing discord. Lucifer, he's cast out, he sows discord in the garden. Adam, blaming Eve, sows discord with Cain, killing Abel, sows discord with Abimelech. You got Israel's at peace, right? And he goes in there and sows the discord in Shechem, and then you got Machiavelli, right, sowing discord and to have the ends justifies the means. And then you got the British Empire coming into these little kingdoms and sowing discord. And then you got the British Empire in America with the Red Stick Creek Indians and Fort Mims Massacre and the sowing of discord. And then you got the National Socialist Workers' Party in Germany with the brown shirts sowing discord and Stalin sowing discord. This is the strategy. How do you destroy a marriage? Discord. How do you destroy a family? Discord. How do you destroy a church? Discord. How do you destroy a country? Discord. What's God's answer? Forgive. 2 days ago, I had the privilege, the honor to speak at Sarasota, Florida's 50th anniversary Mayor's Prayer Breakfast. And one of the other speakers was Ricky Bolden, a former Cleveland Browns football player, who's like about this big. And he gave a great talk. He said, Jesus tells us to love our brothers. But what if somebody, we don't want to call him a close, brother. We want him to be a little distant, so we'll call him neighbor. Well, Jesus says you must love your neighbor. What if they're not our brother and they're not we don't really, matter of fact, they're our enemy. And Jesus says, love your enemy. He says, you can't get away from it. Love is our side of the table. Our response to everything must be love. It must be forgiveness. Right? Jesus says, unless you forgive, you will not be forgiven. And our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, the kingdom come, the will be done on earth as it. Forgive us our trespasses as we, to the same exact degree that we forgive others. Right? Critical race theory wokeness says, don't forgive. Cancel your enemy. Get them to lose their job. Boycott their business. Punish them. And even if somebody's going along and they're nice and woke and you discover a tweet they did 10 years ago, you cancel them, you destroy their life. There's no forgiveness. There's no, hey, I've changed. I'm now really woke. We don't care. You back then, right? And then what do you do with Ezekiel, where it says that the child shall not pay for the parent's sins. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. Right? You don't make some kid pay for something that some ancestor did. Right? And I thought this was interesting. Devil takes Jesus to a high mountain, shows him all the kingdoms of the world and all their splendor, and says, if you bow down and worship me, I'll give them to you, because they're mine to give. I can give them to whoever I want. And Jesus says, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. But you think that's pretty audacious of the devil to say all the kingdoms are his. When did he get them? When Adam sinned. Adam was in charge of the garden. We know that because he named everything. Naming means you have authority over. You have kids, you get to name your kids. Right? Adam named everything. He was in charge. But the Bible says, to whomever you yield your members, servants to obey, to him you are a servant. The moment Adam obeyed Satan, he was posturing himself as the one taking the orders and the devil being in charge. And the devil usurps power, and every kingdom of the world is ruled by fear. And Jesus says, the kings of this world are called benefactors, and they rule. And he goes, but it shall not be so among you. The greatest among you shall be the servant of all. So Jesus is saying, my kingdom is different from all the kingdoms of the world. Theirs is all forced top down. Mine's all voluntary bottom up. All right? And so the kingdoms of the world are through fear. Here's a sultan of Delhi, India. He said, fear of the governing power is the basis of all good government. Right? So we have the worldly system wants to get you into fear, because then you'll trade freedom for security. Right? You'll submit. Fear is the tool. And God says, don't get in fear. Stay in faith. Right? That's why I love Pastor Steve. Whenever I'm around him, my faith grows. I mean, I just see what's going on here. It's like, man, you have to hang around people that have faith. You have to go to a church where the pastor has faith, a big vision, right? Because faith is contagious. Courage is contagious. So we see these crises, one after the other, that have earmarks of being planned. I spoke at Emporia, Kansas, and they had the city auditorium, and a former state rep organized it. And they said, yeah, they were having riots, and they were going to have they were going to have a peaceful protest in Emporia, but somebody dropped off a pallet of bricks right where they were going to begin their peaceful protest, and there's no construction in the area. And I talked to people in Dallas. There's a pallet of bricks dropped off. And talked to people in all these different states all around the country. Just coincidentally, a pallet of bricks is dropped off. A tremendous amount of organizing went into this. I mean, where's the NSA when you need them? I mean, shouldn't they? I thought they were monitoring everything. Didn't they know about this to stop it? Or maybe they did know about it. And anyway, then there's some areas where people just refuse to riot because they forgive. And so they import people from other countries that have a propensity for rioting. And then let's look at the COVID response. What was the first thing? They let criminals out of jail. Did you catch that? And he's like, really? You couldn't move them somewhere else? And then you let criminals out, crime goes up. And then some people feel afraid and they move out of the big cities. Well, who moves out? Maybe pro-family people. Well, they usually belong to one particular political party. Well, who's left in the city? More people that are dependent on entitlements. Well, they tend to belong to a different political party. And then COVID response was close businesses. And then let them get looted and vandalized and order the police to stand down and defund the police. And so pro-business people move out of the big cities. Okay, they tend to belong to that first political party. And then churches are shut down. And that's where pro-life conservatives organize. And then kids who have been indoctrinated with hate America are available to riot. You think, who would want to get kids to riot? Well, in 1963, Albert Herlong, congressman, reads into the congressional record these communist goals. One was get control of schools, use them as transmission belts for socialism, communist propaganda. In others, get control of Teachers Association, put party line in textbooks, use student riots to foment public protest. Back in 1963, they've already been planning on using students to do rioting. And so the net COVID response was more people of one political party move out of the big cities, leaving the other party with monopoly control of city politics. And in election years, whoever wins the big city wins the state. Whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes for the state, and the president is elected by electoral votes. They actually boiled it down to 6 cities. That's all they needed. All right? Phoenix, Detroit, Atlanta, Philadelphia, right? And all they had to do was have the violence, and then the people from one party move out, and the other one, right, for some reason, they can. I actually spent like 3 days with Mike Lindell doing the Lindell TV, and he had these guys there who had their doctorates in statistical analysis. One was a Dr. Frank, and they literally looked at every one of the 3,000 some odd counties in America and every election of every county from the beginning of the record keeping from the county. How many people are in the county, how many are registered to vote, how many vote, and they just plot them all. And then in 2020, all of a sudden, they have like 40% more people voting than there are people in the county. Yeah. And lo and behold, it happens all around the country by the exact same percentage. It's like, okay, this defies statistical chance, right? And anyway, so fear is where you get people into fear, they'll trade freedom for security, and then the other's free stuff. And what's the free stuff? That's the Great Reset. And Karl Marx, Frederick Engels says that they were alchemists of the revolution. I read this before. Business consists of spurring it into artificial crises. Every new crisis must be more serious, more universal than the last. Every fresh slump must ruin more small capitalists. This will increase the number of the unemployed. In the end, commercial crisis will lead to a social revolution. You think, who would want to ruin small capitalists? Socialism is a ruling class and a ruled class. There's no room for a middle class because the middle class could pool their money and challenge the ruling class, so they want to get rid of them. And Lenin is credited with the statement, grind the middle class out of existence between the two millstones of taxation and inflation. Taxation is you just take away their money, and inflation is you create trillions and trillions of dollars out of nothing for stimulus programs and infrastructure projects that are not really intended to stimulate and build the infrastructure. They're just intended to have more dollars chase the same amount of goods. Price of goods skyrockets, and people that are on fixed income aren't able to survive. And then they go to the government and say, help, and the government says, here's the check. And then you get used to the check, and then say, oh, if you want to continue to get that check, you got to get the most recent booster. And they now got to file online so we can get the matrix of your face. And we matched it up with a gun registration record. You have a gun, you got to give up your guns if you want to continue to get the check. And before you know it, you're being slowly put into dependency and controlled. And this is what I think may be happening with this big global picture with Ukraine. So it's terrible what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, but it's clear that the Biden administration is friends with Russia. You think friends with Russia? Yeah, that the Biden administration is using Russia to negotiate our treaty with Iran. And part of the treaty says that Iran can give uranium to Russia. It's like, okay, I mean, they're supposed to be our enemy, and here we're having them negotiate it. It's like, anyway. So plan of action for U.S. So if Russia is squeezed financially and then has to do the deals with China, then there's trillions of dollars the U.S. doesn't want, and then the price of the dollar will inflate even more. Here's a 1934 Chicago Tribune article, says, cartoon says, spend under the guise of recovery, bust the government, blame the capitalists for the failure, junk the Constitution, declare a dictatorship. On the side, it says it worked in Russia. So that's that spending, but your goal really isn't to fix the country, it's just to waste money. And so during the Depression, we had that in America with FDR creating all these different things to seize a lot of control. He even, by 3,000 executive orders, he outlawed by a mandate the private ownership of gold. I mean, people were burying gold coins in coffee cans in their backyards. And so this is increased under LBJ. It's called the Great Society Welfare State. And he was implementing what's called the Cloward Piven strategy, two socialist professors at Columbia University that said, it's hard to have communism instituted with tanks from the front door, but you go around the back door and you sign up as many people as possible for welfare. and then they'll gradually begin to surrender their freedoms to continue to get that. And anyway, so I don't know. There's a lot more there. This is an interesting gentleman. So his name was Manning Johnson, and he, in the 1930s, became a communist. And he even ran for Congress in New York as a communist. And he saw that some successful black men wanted to build a hospital and have it be first class. And he saw that the Jews have hospitals, Catholics have hospitals. He said, we want to have a hospital. And he witnessed the communists undermining their whole effort. And then he saw some successful black men wanting to build a real estate development and have it have fountains and bridges and shops and be really nice. And he witnessed the communists undermining all their efforts. And he said, you really don't want to help our community. You're just using us. And so he left them. And he testified before Congress. He wrote a book called Color, Communism, and Common Sense. Archibald Roosevelt, the son of Teddy Roosevelt, writes the foreword. And he talks about how the communists first went into his communities and would try to get him to spit on the Bible and kick the Bible, and they wouldn't because they were too attached to the Bible. So he says their next plan was to change the gospel. And he says the new line went like this: Jesus the carpenter was a worker like the communists. He was against the money changers, the capitalists, the exploiters of the day. This is why he drove them from the temple. Communists are the modern day fighters against the capitalists or the money changers. If Jesus were living today, he'd be persecuted like the communists. So forget the gospel, we're all sinners going to hell, and Jesus, the only begotten Son of God, died on the cross to pay for our sins. Forget that. Jesus was just an activist. And anyway, this is tough because there's a whole lot more. So I thought this was interesting. You've probably seen the little video of critical race theory of all these students on a starting line, and the teacher says, if you're from a home with two parents, you have a special advantage, take a step forward. And if you're from a safe neighborhood, you have a special advantage. Take a step forward. And if you have this, that, or the other, you take a step. So pretty soon, some kids are way in the front, and the other ones are on the starting line. And the camera looks at their faces, and they're like, this isn't fair. And it's a pretty convincing video until you ask yourself the question, what's the finish line? Is the finish line how much stuff you can accumulate before you die and leave it all behind? Or is the finish line standing before God and him saying, I was sick and in prison, did you visit me? I was naked, did you clothe me? I was hungry, did you feed me? Whatever you did, at least he's my brethren, you've done unto me. Yeah, I've blessed you with stuff. Yeah, I've given you more advantages, but the more I give you, the more I expect you to give it away. We don't need to teach critical race theory in school. We need to send evangelists and youth pastors into the school to get these kids born again. Because once they experience the love and acceptance of God, they're going to love everybody. Your spirit, mind, and body. Your mind's like a super fancy computer. Your body's like the computer case, which makes it silly for people to argue over what color the computer case is. Imagine if I were to tell you red computers are better than green computers. You're like, really doesn't matter what color the computer is? What matters is what software. It doesn't matter what color the iPhone is, what apps are on it. And so it doesn't matter what color somebody's skin is what behavioral software is in their brain. Is it love your enemies, do good to them that hate you, bless them that curse you, walk the extra mile, turn the other cheek? Or is it this selfish malware, corrupted violence? And so, let's see here. Trying to find a place to land the plane. And so the crisis. We've talked about crises and how in times of crises, I don't know, I didn't even get to this part. So I get into marketing of products, and basically they realize that if they make it look like everybody's using it, then people will buy a product. And so they now apply it to politics, and they want to make it look like everybody believes something, and then you'll cave. And so it's the group. They want to manipulate the group perception because we all want to fit in with the group. And Goebbels was the minister of propaganda for the Nazis, and I've got lots of stuff on this slide. But
come back. Need another seminar.
This is all going into your subconscious. You're going to have dreams of so the group. So the idea people want to fit in with the group. We're social creatures, right? you have, let's see here. I flipped one picture up there that helps. So a water molecule is an individual water molecule, but you put it together with other water molecules, it operates in a group, right? You got waves and clouds. A fish is a fish, but you put it together with other fish, they operate in a group. A bird's in a cage, but you put it together with other birds, they operate in a group. Human beings are individuals, but you put us together with other human individuals, we operate as a group. We're constantly giving and receiving feedback. Are we being accepted or rejected? We want to be accepted. We do not want to be rejected. This is the primal human experience. In most countries of the world, it's called honor-shame culture. They don't have a concept of right and wrong. What causes you to be accepted and honored in your group is good, and what causes you to be rejected and shamed and ostracized from your group is bad. And so at the beginning of America, the majority of the group was Christian. And so you would have non-Christians adopting Christian behavior to fit in with this majority Christian group. But now they have co-opted the public opinion molding sectors of society, right? The 7 pillars, they've co-opted the influencers. And so now the perception is all online, and it's, are you being liked and friended and followed, or blocked and canceled and deplatformed? And so they're manipulating what people think is the group to move the country into their political agenda. And the group is very powerful. Here's Peter. He's been with Jesus 3 years. He looks Jesus in the eye and says, I will never deny you. A couple hours later, Peter is around a group around a fire. And a girl gets in his face and says, you were with Jesus. And you can just picture Peter looking at everybody else around the fire, and they're all looking at him, and they're about to shove him out. And he says, I never met the guy. Been with him 3 years, told him just to his face a couple hours ago. The power of wanting to be accepted or rejected in a group is extremely powerful. Now, after the resurrection, Peter was filled with the Holy Spirit, and he stood up to the Sanhedrin. And they said, we told you not to speak in this name again. And he says, we must obey God rather than men. So all of a sudden, Peter has had a change. He doesn't care what the group says. He doesn't care what the men says. He only cares what God says. That is where God is pushing us and pushing the world to have to make the decision. Are we going to crave and seek the honor and praise of men, or are we only going to care about the praise that comes from God? And the Giants pitcher, Sam Coonrod, was the only one that didn't kneel in protest. Afterwards, they asked him why. He says, I'm a Christian, so I just believe that I can't kneel before anybody besides God. Amen. And Jonathan Isaac was the only player that didn't kneel, Orlando Magic forward. He says, all lives supported through the gospel. Everyone's made in the image of God, and we share in his glory. All right? It's only when you have a relationship with God can you not care about what people say about you, what they post online about you, what they, But if you don't have a relationship with God, your worth is dependent on how well the group likes you. And anyway, so every generation has a crisis, and the crisis is an opportunity for the people that are alive at that time to respond. And I use this little illustration. The time period we live in is a solution in the beaker, like a freshman chemistry class. And the teacher pours in a catalyst that causes a reaction. And some stuff precipitates, goes to the bottom of the beaker, and other stuff gets effervescent and bubbly and goes to the top. So the time period we're living in is the solution in the beaker. The crisis of our time period is the catalyst that's poured in, and there's a reaction. The catalyst causes some people to precipitate and drop out and run away and get scared and even deny their faith. But that same catalyst causes other people to get effervescent and bubbly and be more bold in their faith. Like the early church, when they were persecuted, they prayed for more boldness. They prayed for more effervescence. Amen. So I'm convinced the same crisis that's going to cause some people to cave and take the mark of the beast is going to cause us believers to be more bold than ever before, because we know that the time of his coming is close, right? It's going to be an exciting time. And it's in times of crises that people turn to Christ, but it's also in times of crises that leaders rise up. So what are the stories we love best in the Bible? It's when there's a crisis and God raises up little nobodies with faith and courage. So someday you're going to be dead. It's a nice way to end a message. So good night. But you're going to be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun, imagine you've been in heaven 10,000 years. You're walking the streets of gold, and you meet Moses. And Moses will invite you over to his place. I don't know what it's like in heaven, but Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many mansions. I bet Moses will have a pretty nice place. He'll probably have one of those big fireplaces where the logs don't burn up. Get it, the burning bush in the wilderness didn't burn up, and the logs in his fireplace. I heard one preacher say, in heaven, you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I was thinking about something else. I don't know. And, but what if you're there, and it's like tonight, right? It's about maybe he's got a big living room like tonight, and he's sitting right in front of you. And after the small talk's over, you tap him on the shoulder and say, Moses, tell us the story again. I mean, I read the book. I even saw the movie. But here you are in person. The room will get quiet. Moses will stand up, and he goes, I was 80 years old. And Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, was charging in at us with these chariots, the brand new invention of iron chariot wheels, and these big sharp swords. And we were totally unarmed. And I just stood there with my staff and I said, God, use me to deliver your people. And he stood in faith, and the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. We're going to say, wow. Then we're going to look around the room and see David. Say, David, tell us your story. The room will get quiet. David will stand up and he goes, I was just a teenager. And this thug, Goliath, was mocking our God, making fun of our faith. And these grown-ups were too chicken to do anything about it. And I said, enough of that. I took my little sling and I went out there and hit him in the head, and I took his own sword and chopped his head off. And then we're going to see Gideon. He's going to say, 100,000 Midianites. I got 30,000 Israelites. And God said, tell everyone that's scared to go home. Great, now I'm down to 10,000. Still too many. Go drink from a creek. Whittles it down to 300. And then God says, watch this. God wanted to make it look really bad odds, right? And everybody's going to tell their story. The Apostle Paul, Deborah, and then everyone in the room is going to look at you. Said, we haven't heard your story yet. Tell us your story. What was going on earth when it was your turn to be down there? What were they saying about God in your country? What did they say about the baby that the Lord knew in the mother's womb, or marriage that God himself instituted in Genesis? Or what did you do when the whole world was against you and people were saying bad things about you? What did you do when you were even backstabbed by some of your Christian friends and you were about to give up on it all, but you just kept your eyes on Jesus? And you just had just a little thread of faith, but you hung on to it, and then it turned into a string, and then a cord, and then a rope, and then a cable, and finally the blessings of God came back. You know, I'd hate for any of us to be up there and Jesus to walk in and him have a screen come down, and on his great miracles happening and people coming to the Lord, and him saying, this is what I had planned for you to do, but you just didn't have enough faith and courage. And you look back at your life, and that mountain that held you back was just a little anthill, and you go, I let that fear of man, what are people going to say about me, hold me back from doing all this great stuff. And you can't go back to earth and do anything else for Jesus because you're already in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. But guess what? We're still on this earth. We still have breath in our lungs. We still have feet that trod the soil. You still can do those things that you will be known for forever. It's like a basketball game. Jesus is the coach. You're on the bench, and he comes over and he slaps you on the back and he says, okay, your turn, get in the game. And you're like, coach, they're playing really tough out there. Yeah, I know. It's your turn. Get in the game. But somebody just got knocked down. He goes, yeah, but you're 7 feet tall. They're 4 feet tall. You can do this. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. Though 1,000 fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, it shall not come nigh thee. Out of the thousands of years of world history, the good Lord chose for you to be alive right now. He controls time, matter, space, energy. He knows every dirty backroom deal that everybody's doing, and he knows that in times of crises, people are going to cave, but in times of crises, people are going to turn to Christ. It's going to be the greatest revival. It's not going to be orchestrated on the top. It's going to happen with individuals on their own, letting the Lord, the Holy Spirit, use them to touch people in their local community. This is the time that God has planned for great things to happen, and he loves to use little nobodies who are small in their own eyes to do big things. God bless you.
address one thing real quick on Ukraine?
All right.
Ask you a question?
All right.
Just sit down for one more minute, if you would. Whatever you were going to do right now, you're late for it anyway. It's not going to matter. I'm going to ask Bill to just briefly address two questions in regard to Russia and Ukraine. First one is under Bill Clinton, when they had them disarm, there were commitments made to Ukraine by us and other nations that doesn't look like they're being fulfilled. Would you address that? Secondly, so what is Putin's reason for going into Ukraine?
Well, it's important for us to understand that you have what's called international money laundering. So wherever you see the U.S. government give billions of dollars to third world countries for climate change or whatever, the money usually goes to a corrupt leader in that country that gets to keep a sliver of it, and the rest of it is funneled back to the corrupt politicians in America or the corrupt bankers. Right? Howard Phillips was a friend of mine. He was involved really big when they were giving away the Panama Canal. I was in Panama back in the 1978, I think. And but the people in Panama didn't want to be separated from America. But the big banks had lent money to the country, and the country couldn't pay it back, and we gave it away, and then the U.S. government would subsidize the canal zone, and then the money would get paid back to the bank. And Howard Phillips says, yeah, the money doesn't even leave New York or Washington, D.C. It just goes from the U.S. government to the bank, and Panama's left out of the loop, right? These different globalist IMF funds and so forth, they'll take U.S. money, loan it to these third world countries. They'll let the corrupt leader put it in Swiss bank accounts, and then they'll even destabilize it so they can't pay it back. And that the leader had pledged the country's assets as collateral. And so when they couldn't pay back the debts, the IMF would come in and go ahead and claim all their mining rights and farming rights and fishing rights and minerals and so forth. Jack Kemp, I don't know if you remember him. I met him and spoke with him years ago before he died. And he actually did an article that was in Reader's Digest. He goes, you want to know where the next crisis in the world is going to be? Look where the IMF's lending money. And so you look at Ukraine, and they had leaders that were investigating corruption of Hunter Biden and his laptop and the Burisma company. And Hunter Biden knows nothing about energy, and yet the pressure was put to put him on the board and pay him millions of dollars. And his friend Archer, somebody, right, gets put on the board. He knows nothing about it. And we have the basically corrupt politicians in America pressuring the leaders of these countries to put their kids. But the goal is to funnel the money back to the corrupt politicians. Remember the earthquake in Haiti? And literally billions of dollars that went to the Clinton Foundation. Yeah. And I talked to people in Haiti. None of it went to the people in Haiti. Went to the Clinton Foundation. That some of it went to corrupt politicians in Haiti, but the rest of it was funneled back into that particular person's campaign efforts. And so there's a quote from William Henry Harrison, 9th president, gives the longest inaugural address, dies 30 days later, but it's a really good address. But he said that the danger to free governments is the unwillingness of the people to believe in the existence of designing men. In other words, good people, you want to think that the other people are as good as you are. You want to give them the benefit of the doubt. Well, and it's really hard for you to imagine that there are people that want to scam. There are people that want to sex traffic little children. There are people that want to do really bad things. But our mind can't even imagine that wickedness because we don't live in that world. But they do exist. And the Bible says, be wise as a serpent, innocent as a dove. So we need to know they exist. We need to know how they work. And while we have been sitting back, a lot of these politicians have been using their positions to work. Now, you add to this those that have a global goal, and they want to have a one world government. And it goes all the way back to, Cain, kill, and Abel, and Nimrod, Tower of Babel. And you look through history. I've written several books on the back table back there, but I go through, you have, 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs, 5,000 years of Chinese emperors, Indian Maharajas. You have Attila the Hun. You have Genghis Khan. You have, and if any of those leaders hadn't have died, they'd have been glad to keep killing and conquering. I mean, Genghis Khan killed 30 million people. If he hadn't died, he'd have been happy to keep going. Right? Mao Zedong kills 80 million people. If he hadn't died, he'd have kept going on. Right? And so death, in a sense, is a blessing because the devil has to start from scratch, right, to try to get his plans going again. But that same Jesus, the devil tempts Jesus, right? The kingdom of the world mine. I can give him to whoever he wants. And clearly there's an ultimate goal. It's going to max out on a global level. And Jesus says, wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. I make it sort of simple. The spiritual descendants, so to speak, of Cain are always trying to kill the spiritual descendants of Abel. What's the difference? Cain worshiped God through his works. If you do works, you can be proud of your works. And pride is the sin of Satan. And when your works are rejected, it says Cain's countenance fell. His pride was hurt. He was offended. And then he got filled full of hatred and anger, wanted to murder his brother that had the revelation of the Lamb. So Abel approached God through the Lamb. And so Noah sacrificed lambs when he got off the ark. Abraham sacrificed lambs. Moses said every family in Israel sacrificed a lamb. The high priest brings the blood of the lamb into the Holy Holy, sprinkles it on the mercy seat. Right? Solomon had 1,000 of them killed when he dedicated the temple. And then John the Baptist says, behold Jesus, the Lamb of God. And so they had faith in the Lamb to come. They didn't know his name. We have faith in the Lamb that came. We know his name. But salvation's through the Lamb. Right? It's not us being good enough in pride. There's going to be nobody in heaven prideful saying, hey, I was here because I was good enough. No, the only people in heaven are the ones that I don't deserve to be here. I'm a terrible sinner. It's because of that guy walking across the street with the holes in his hands. He's the reason I'm here. Jesus, the Son of God that died on the cross to pay for it. So everybody in heaven is going to be humble. It's not going to be any prideful people. I was really good. I got here. No, nobody's good enough. And but you see, the stakes are getting higher, and it is getting to a global level with the 5G and the satellites and the fact that you could have an instant COVID response spread around the entire world locking down. I mean, this is like, and now with the, but as far as the Russia-Ukraine, I think there were leaders that definitely wanted to get rid of corruption, but Biden goes over there and says, unless you fire that guy who's investigating the corruption of my son, I'm going to hold back billions of dollars. You can see the video. And he goes, and guess what? By 6 o'clock, they fired that guy. I mean, this is extortion.
Yes.
Right? This is a crime.
Yeah.
And he was bragging about it. And but it was pressuring this country to get rid of the good guys and let corruption in there. I've talked to somebody else. I've not verified it, so you can verify it yourself. But they were saying that, yeah, a lot of the aid that was being sent over there during Obama-Biden was going to all the wrong people. That the aid was going to neo-Nazi groups that were intentionally sowing division in the country. And then Putin, the best I can figure is he has aspirations to, increase, maybe get to the boundaries of what the former USSR was. I don't know. I've heard things from the people that have been missionaries in Russia, and they said, no matter what, he's deep down a pretty corrupt guy. And I think he was lured to invade, very similar to Saddam Hussein was more or less lured to try to take Kuwait. A little background. Soviet-Afghan War, 1979, the U.S. government is arming and training the Taliban in the largest covert CIA operation called Operation Cyclone. And so we, with our CIA, are arming and training these Taliban. it was such a big deal that Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts did a movie about it called Charlie Wilson's War, and Sylvester Stallone did a movie on it called Rambo 3, that our government was arming and training the Taliban. And so the thought that, gee, they could surprise us and take over Afghanistan, it's like, no, you don't leave $85 billion worth of weapons without even trying to destroy it. This was a planned reverting back to the Obama-Biden era policies. And then Jimmy Carter abandons the Shah, and in comes the Ayatollah. And then what starts is the Iran-Iraq war. And we don't want Iran to win with Ayatollah. And so under Reagan and Rumsfeld, we are arming and training Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis to fight the Iranians. And then George W. Bush gets in, and you go back and you read the articles at that time, and it's more or less green light is given to Saddam to say, you know what, if you take Kuwait, no big deal. But then when he does, then the whole world organizes against him, and Bush gives this speech that this is terrible, but out of it will come a new world order. And it made a lot of waves because of that, him directly using that term. And so Bill Clinton was in the Operation Brute Force, was sending millions of dollars worth of arms to the Taliban, to the Iranians, to funnel it to the Bosnian Muslims to fight the Serbian Christians. So lots of things go on that, but then we come up. So you read the speeches of Biden prior to the Russian invasion, and he was giving green light signals, saying, if you go in, we're not going to militarily stop you. We're not going to. He pulls all the U.S. military out of the bases in Ukraine, which is sending a signal saying, okay, if you bomb the bases, you're not going to kill any Americans. And he pulls all the Americans out of the embassy, so he's pulling them out, which is a green light signal saying, if you come in, you won't be killing Americans, so we're not going to get involved. And then I think Putin took the bait, and he came in, and then it's turned into this bigger thing. And so that's why when you read a lot of the Klaus Schwab World Economic Forum, that they want to have be able to track everybody in the world and control everybody's financial transactions. But if they just go to everybody and say, okay, everybody, we want to track you, people say, I don't want that. So they need a crisis. Sort of like what I just got done going through my little presentation, that you have a whole political science timeline of creating crises. And so they need a crisis, and they need to blame it on somebody other than themselves. And so the idea is that now that Putin took the bait and invaded, and he's terrible, and there are terrible things happening, and we need to pray for all the Christians that are caught in the crossfire, right? And that there's going to be economic pressures put on Russia, and they're going to be closed off from the Western financial system using the U.S. dollar, and that they're the third largest supplier of oil, and if they're going to sell it one way or the other, but if they don't have access to then the thought is that they will begin to do transactions with China with a ruble yuan transaction without using the U.S. dollar. And since they're such a big supplier, other countries are going to say, hey, we'll trade without using the U.S. dollar. And if enough countries do that, then the U.S. dollar will lose its position as the world's reserve currency. And there'll be trillions of dollars that have already been created that nobody will want. And they'll be available to come back home and to buy things. And so the price of everything's going to skyrocket even more. And the dollar will buy less and less and less. You'll have $1,000, but it'll all of a sudden be worth $1 in your bank account. And then people are going to say, I can't have $1,000 to fill up my tank of gas. Where are we going to get it? The government will come along and say, we got it all figured out. We're going to all do digital. And we're going to use a new Fed coin, digital dollar. And so just a couple weeks ago, Biden signed the digital dollar agreement so that the banks can just continue to keep things going. It'll just be all, and then over 100 countries have signed digital dollar agreements, or whatever they call it, but it's a digital financial transactions, but it's all tracked by the government. And so, anyway, so just a little good news to brighten your evening. But again, I have to keep myself encouraged by looking at it from God's point of view. You know, he's a just God, which means he has to judge sin. And you think, here we are killing 60 million babies. There's nothing more unjust than killing an unborn baby. It hasn't sinned, it hadn't done anything wrong, but its life is being ended. And so you go back in history, it always appears. So the Canaanites were killing innocent babies. And it even says in the book of Deuteronomy, do not sacrifice your children to Moloch like those gods in Canaan. Right? So they were doing this in Canaan. And then you go through to Manasseh. So Hezekiah was a good king. His son is a terrible king named Manasseh. And Manasseh is sacrificing kids to Moloch. And the prophets come to him and say, you are filling the streets of Jerusalem with the blood of innocent children. God is fed up. It's over. So judgment was pronounced by the prophets. And then Manasseh has a grandson named Josiah. He's 8 years old when he becomes the king. He's 16 years old, starts to seek the Lord. He's in his early 20s. He tells him to clean out the temple that his granddad had trashed. And so they're cleaning out the temple, and they come out with the scroll, the law of God. And Josephus, the Jewish commentator, said it was the last copy of the law on earth. And it was Moses' original copy, wrapped in burlap, buried under stuff, because Manasseh had not just killed kids, he was destroying the copies of the law, cut off the feet of the temple, moved, or the bronze altar, moved it to the side. I mean, he was like putting up a pagan temple there. And so the priests read the law, and they obviously had never read it before, because they said, whoa, this is pretty significant. And so they take it to this young king. He had obviously never heard it before. And they're reading it to him, and he rips his garments and repents and says, dear God, we have sinned against you, and we are headed toward judgment. And so this young king, Josiah, sends his servants to a prophetess named Huldah. She's the wife of the king's tailor. And she is a woman in Jerusalem that has a reputation for hearing from God. Contemporary of Jeremiah, but he's not in town at the time. And so Huldah tells the servants to say, tell the man that sent you that judgment will come on this nation because of its sins, but it'll not happen during his lifetime because he repented when he heard the words of the Lord. And so for the rest of the 31-year reign of Josiah, there's peace and prosperity. He has like the largest Passover ever. He sends the Levites all around the country to teach the law, and they have a revival. And you do the timeline, it was during that revival that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got saved. You know, if you were to use that term. And so I'm praying for a Josiah generation. We've killed 60 million babies. What's a just God supposed to do? If he doesn't judge and if he's silent, he's silent to giving consent. And if he's a God that gives consent to killing innocent babies, he's unjust. So his very nature is he has to judge sin. If we repent, he can put it off. He's still going to judge. It's going to wait till later. And if they repent, it's going to wait till later. And he can put it off a long time. People say, what do you think God's going to do? I had this thought. What if God's looking at us to decide what he's going to do? Right? The prophet Jeremiah went to King Zedekiah and said, if you repent of your sins and go out and surrender to the king of Babylon, Jerusalem will be spared. You know, your wives and family will be spared. Everybody's going to be spared. But if you don't, every building here is going to be torn down. The temple will be burnt, and all your kids are going to be burned and killed. And in other words, people say God knows the future. He knows all the possible futures. Right? He knows everything. Now, his will is going to eventually take place. But he went to Zedekiah and says, okay, here's the choice. And here's consequence A, here's consequence B, and you choose. Right? And so I think that he's coming to us and he says, okay, you choose. If you repent, I can put it off. I'm convinced that's why we can't figure out the year that Jesus is going to come back. Because he's given himself some leeway, right? If we repent, he can put it off and all the numbers will work out perfect when it finally works out, you know? And I'm not a theologian, so if I say anything wrong, Pastor will fix it after I leave. But anyway,